Hello, and thank you for joining us for this year's Summer Scholars presentations. My name is Michael Kelly, and I'm a historian here at the Australian War Memorial's Military History section. Since 1985, the History section at the Memorial has hosted 111 young scholars under the Summer Scholars scheme, providing them with practical experience of working in a major historical institution. Each scholar is paired with an academic supervisor from the Military History section. The key difference between our Summer Scholars program and other similar programs in Canberra is that when our scholars arrive, we give them their project, and it is usually something outside their area of study and interest. That means that what you'll be hearing today is the outcome of 6 weeks of intensive archival research, and I think you'll agree with me, the results are very impressive. I would like to introduce you to Alex Barilaro from Deakin University in Melbourne and Olivia Ormsby from Flinders University in South Australia. This year, we'll be changing our format from the 20-minute presentation of previous years. While the time frame remains the same, the presentation will take the form of a more informal chat, with me hosting and posing questions throughout. We will now move on to our first speaker, Alex, who will deliver his presentation on the Australian experience in Asia at the end of the Second World War.
Quick disclaimer, Mick, this video contains conflict-related material, including offensive language, coarse language, and dated language, as well as some images which people may find unsettling or uncomfortable. So viewer discretion is very much advised.
Thank you very much, Alex.
The 15th of August, 1945, VP Day, or Victory in the Pacific Day. A soldier serving in Bougainville wrote that this was the greatest news of the century. A 12-year-old girl in Adelaide wrote to her future self the words, "At last." Sailors off the coast of Japan were getting bombed by 4 Japanese aircraft. A Sydney woman discovered that her husband had been killed on the 8th of August and shot down over Borneo. Prisoners of war near Japan, or in Japan in Nagasaki, had inklings that the war might be over. Prisoners of war around the Pacific in places like Johor had no inklings. They were on the brink of starvation. A RAAF pilot, meanwhile, cared only for when his sweetheart would arrive back from the UK. On the 8th of May 1945, for VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, that RAAF pilot, he was in London, off to see the King at Buckingham Palace give the celebratory victory speech. The prisoners of war in the Pacific, and even in Japan, had no idea that the war in Europe had ended. Celebrations in Sydney were rather muted. They still had a war that they needed to win. Prisoners of war in Europe were on trains going from Europe to London. They were on their way back home. And sailors off the coast of Japan were looking in the skies, watching for the next kamikaze. The end of the Second World War in Australia, it is jubilation, relief, partying. It's town squares becoming impromptu dance floors. It's strangers kissing. It's just one big party back home. But the reality is, of course, that there was so much more in terms of emotion than just on the 15th of August. The Second World War didn't just end on one day. It was a build-up that took weeks, months for some. And it did not just end on one day. It didn't just end with people being told, oh, the war's over now. Sometimes it took days, sometimes it took weeks, and for some, it even took months. To briefly put down the Second World War reaction to one image of a dancing man or a novelty knitted sweater is to undersell the sheer weight that the Second World War put on these people and the complexities of emotions. The end of the Second World War was a kaleidoscope of emotions inherent within people, ranging from Melbourne to Sydney, sure, but also to Johor, to Fukuoka, to Bougainville, to everyone serving in or around Asia. Kids were running around, banging garbage lids. Everyone was shouting and singing. Everyone was whistling, waving. Some were getting drunk, but everyone was deliriously happy. Except, of course, history is more complicated than that. The Second World War cannot just be summed up by that quote or by images of dancing men. It was several moments with a whole kaleidoscope of emotions inherent within it. And so today, we'll be exploring that kaleidoscope of emotions. And the best way to express it is through some examples of prisoners of war around the Pacific. Not just in Changi, but in places like Johor, like Fukuoka. Soldiers' experiences in places like Bougainville, sailors off the coast of Japan. They all had myriad reactions to the end of the war. One of those soldiers in Bougainville summed it up like this. We just stayed there, waiting for something to happen, and something did happen. A runner came through along the track and told us to come back to camp. The war was over. But was it?
So Alex, can you explain, just looking at these experiences all around Asia and in the Pacific, how was the war still not over? And can you explain some of these experiences that the Australians felt and had in this period of time?
Well, yeah, so the war, of course, officially ends on the 15th of August. It more officially ends with the surrender on the 2nd of September, taken by General MacArthur on the USS Missouri. But if we take that date, the 15th of August, well, for some, the war did end, especially for those back home. For others, they were in the jungle with Japanese enemies who either didn't hear or didn't want to believe that the war was over. For some, the war didn't end at all. Take Sergeant Arnold Lockyer, for example. He was shot down over Borneo and then captured by the Japanese on the 15th of August, or the 14th of August, actually. He was held in a camp in North Celebes, and then 5 days later, on the 20th of August, 5 days after the war was ended, he was shot, murdered, by Japanese guards who would go on to be convicted of war crimes. So for some people, the war didn't end at all, even when it was nominally over. For others, including the soldiers of Bougainville and soldiers in places like Wewak, the war could be over in a day, could be over in a week. They still had Japanese enemies firing bullets at them. So in Wewak, as the Australians sent up fireworks to celebrate the end of the war, they were also sending missiles at the same time to bomb the Japanese enemy across the way. The war was a complicated thing. It couldn't just end in one instant, not for these soldiers who'd been fighting in the jungle for so long. There were also the cases of prisoners of war in places like Johor. They had no news, no rumour. There was simply Japanese guards stopping the mine details, stopping the work. And then, eventually, the Japanese guards told them, right, it's all over. The camp is yours now. And for these men, it was just about getting enough food to survive. Their diet consisted of tapioca and roots foraged from nearby ground. It wasn't a pleasant experience, to say the least. These men were on the verge of complete and total starvation, and they weren't to know when the Red Cross planes came in and they were dropping food supplies. These people weren't to know that the worst thing to treat starvation is an abundance of food. One wrote in his diary, "Our eyes are bigger than our bellies, and one poor chap last night ate a pint of sugar and died during the night." Some of these men weighed as little as 49 kilos. So it's understandable why they would think the best thing to do would just be to start gorging on food. But as the food grew and their hunger lessened, concern turned to restlessness. And they weren't aware that the war was over until the 28th of August, when American bombers dropped some leaflets over the jail that they'd turned into a temporary camp, telling them that yes, the war was over, you'll be going home. Some of the men were so tense and living on their nerves that they actually died due to the relief. Again, 16, 17 days after the war is officially over, these men are dying in a temporary jail, having been liberated from their prisoner of war camp. There were also men closer to the nucleus of activity on Fukuoka, in the prisoner of war camp near Nagasaki. Now, they didn't know the war was over until the 17th of August, so it still took them 3 days. All they knew was work in the mines was stopping. When they did, well, they had celebrations similar to those that we saw in places like Melbourne and Sydney. Similar to that first quote that I told you about the kids dancing in the street. They had parties, celebrations, national anthems were sung. All the groups of men were cheering and drinking, including specifically the Dutch contingent of Fukuoka, who decided to have a big old ceremony and party in honour of their queen, Wilhelmina. They got their national anthem singing. They decided that everything would be circumstance and pomp in honour of their queen, slightly to the chagrin of a group of Aussies. I'm quoting from a diary here. "A bunch of us got up and said, 'Fuck old Wilhelmina.' Then a Dutchman hit him, and it was on." These were emotionally charged men. They were tense at the end of their tether. They could not just get rid of the trauma with the words, "Oh, the war is over now."
So it sounds like there's still a bunch of emotional outpourings, and not only in Japan but all throughout Asia. Explain a little bit more about those sort of feelings.
Absolutely. Well, the men here were at the end of their tether. Just saying the war was over wasn't going to, get rid of the tension, just the emotions inherent. These were still men who could see the visible scars of their internment on them. And that was the same for all the soldiers serving in the jungle, for all the soldiers serving around the Navy able seamen, whoever it was around the Pacific, and of course for prisoners of war in places like Johor. But we can't ignore the scenes on the home front, because they were a reaction to the end of the war in themselves. On the 15th of August, these people had their moment. That endured the war for 6 years, 6 long years. A 12-year-old girl only knew the war. She couldn't remember anything else. So, of course, there was going to be singing, there was going to be dancing. They were going to crowd the streets. Places like Martin Place and Hyde Park in Sydney, like Collins Street in Melbourne, people flooded into it. Strangers were kissing each other. Dance floors were erected in random public squares and streets. Ticker tape fell down from the roof. It was a scene of delirium. But it wasn't that moment of happiness for everyone. One Sydney woman went partying on the street and encountered her sister. Her sister had been called home with an urgent communication, and that urgent communication told her that her husband had been shot down over Borneo on the 8th of August, killed in his first and last air raid. To quote the sister, "There were no celebrations on VP Day for us." Another woman went from dancing on tables in a sailor's pub to consoling her mother, who was breaking down crying. The mother's son, this woman's sister, would not be coming home again. They had to accept that inevitability now. And for others, the war had simply taken too much from them to start celebrating. One man recalled, "There was one man in particular I remember. His only son had been killed in the Air Force, and I remember he shook hands with Dad and said, 'It's a good day for you, Fred.'"
So the ending of the war sounds a lot more complex than we are led to believe by looking at the screens of these films at the end of VP Day. But did the war really wind down, or did celebrations wind down after the 15th?
Well, in Melbourne and Sydney and in cities all across Australia, people partied for 2 days and then went back to work. But it's summed up in what an able seaman said off the coast of Japan in his big old ship. A bloke can't know that the war is over. We're still here in the middle of the Pacific. If you're serving on one of the HMAS ships in the middle of the Pacific, and there are still Japanese mines in the water, and there are still Japanese planes flying overhead, of course you're not going to know the war's over. And for most, especially those in the Pacific, and especially those prisoners of war, the war didn't end. It couldn't end. They were simply too close to everything that had happened in the previous 6 years. For more information beyond the prisoners of war that I'm about to go into, especially those around Japan, please see my paper, which will be published on the War Memorial website in the coming months. And for a lot of these men, they held a bit of scorn, a bit of hatred in their hearts and their minds for the Japanese people. It's only justifiable, given some of the war crimes that were committed, some of the atrocities they saw, or just the severe punishments that a lot of these people were enduring at the hands of Japanese guards. But the interesting thing is that, yes, the war doesn't just end straight away on the 15th of August. We know that. The interesting thing is that most returned to a sense of normalcy. The Japanese, after all, were observing the surrender and observing the terms of the surrender with what one man called amazing docility, with grace and with decorum. There weren't really any problems other than from Japanese soldiers, most of whom were so firm that they didn't believe the surrender or didn't hear about the surrender. So one man said this: "After the first week or so after the war, however, apart from one or two sullen looks from the old ex-soldier, the whole attitude of the Japanese people changed, and our former enemies became polite, likeable, respectful people, only too pleased to help wherever possible. They remain so, as I see it, to this day." Now, there were moments, especially among prisoners of war who had to endure the Japanese order, of people who wanted to go out and get a little bit of retribution. In the words of one who saw 10 men go out looking for the first ex-soldiers in Japan they could get their hands on. These are former prisoners of war. They went out to even things just a little. So they did. They went out, they looked for Japanese ex-soldiers, and when they found them, the fists started flying. The thing is, most of these Japanese ex-soldiers just cut and ran away. So the Australians grabbed the people they'd knocked down, pulled them up, dusted them off, and sent them on their way. Because violence as a whole wasn't doctrinal, wasn't even regular. It wasn't something that most Australian prisoners of war, even around Japan, where they were close to the civilians, wanted to go do. Most simply cherished having a clean bed, clean sheets, enough food, and they thought of home, most among anything. After all, these prisoners of war endured hard work and scant food, and stern Japanese discipline. One wrote, a month before the war's end, "We repeat to each other, day in and day out, that the war must end, and we all agree on that, but as we've been repeating the same thing for 3 years, we aren't getting very far." He also complained that pigs ate better tapioca and greens than they did. A lot of the prisoners of war in Johor would have to scrounge for extra tapioca in the bins of the Imperial Japanese Army. That's how close they were to starvation. And for Australian prisoners of war in Japan, or closer to that nucleus of activity, they had a different set of challenges to sustain. Japanese Navy would often come and deliver beatings, probably because they wanted to take out their aggression on something. They also had the same strict regiment, but with Japanese guards who were far closer and far more comfortable in their surroundings. After 3.5 years of strict rule, of Japanese enforced guidelines, of Japanese enforced bedtime, of Japanese enforced meal times and waking up times and conversation, of course these men were going to want to let loose somehow. That brief period that I mentioned before, where they could just celebrate and have parties and get into fistfights with Dutchmen, that could only last so long. They found themselves suddenly in control of these camps, which had been their prisons. They found themselves in the middle of Japan, or somewhere in Nagasaki, or somewhere in a city off the coast. They had it all to themselves. They could do whatever they want. So, naturally, some of them decided to test how far they could go. One man wrote, "Cars and trucks have been borrowed, requisitioned, or taken by force. The latest mania is the collection of Nipponese swords. Some chaps are making a business of it. They just dash off a receipt for a sword. Most of the nips accept that. Others object strongly, but all with the same result. Others decided to see how much further they could push it. Some of the lads have landed back from robbing a bank. They have bags full of money. They'd been drinking all morning, and when that started to pall, they decided they would go rob a bank, see if that would give them a kick. They had rather a hectic night the night before, and needed something to follow it up."
So was this, with the POWs, was this about them getting revenge, and did this happen everywhere else that POWs were around Asia as well, or was this mainly sort of in Japan?
Well, no, because revenge wasn't really a thing. Prisoners of war didn't really have revenge on their mind. Most of them were too weak, for example. I mean, they couldn't even contemplate getting revenge. And even these guys robbed a bank after the official surrender in September. And they did it because they were bored. They didn't have anything else to do. No one was coming to get them. They were in the middle of a civilian population. They were running their own camp after years of imprisonment, and they thought, let's see what we can get away with. And it worked. They could see how much they could get away with. They could go steal swords, go steal fire trucks, and some even decided, yeah, let's go rob a bank, because there was nothing better to do. It was also, and I need to stress this, not just typical of Australian prisoners of war. Men from the Navy would come in on sojourn from their ships, including a bunch from the HMAS Shropshire, who came into Tokyo and commandeered 3,700 bottles of beer, citing the contamination of the water supply. Most of that beer supply was gone by the time their sojourn was over, and they headed back to the ship. And also, we shouldn't just pen this down to Australians. This was men of all stripes and colours, men of all nationalities, especially those who'd been in prisoner of war camps. For example, British officers who'd been in the same Fukuoka Japanese prisoner of war camp decided that they were going to requisition or commandeer a luxury car that befitted their stature. And then American officers had to follow suit because they couldn't be outdone. This was another normal, natural reaction to the end of the Second World War when you're in the middle of a place that had once been captivity and, look, you can do whatever you like. Some men, in fact, most prisoners of war, after liberation were requisitioned a bottle of beer each day, and some decided to take matters into their own hands and go a step further, and they would write further requisitions for beer, and they would all sign them General MacArthur. These were men of all shapes and colours, just enjoying their freedom. And why'd they do it? Well, like I said, they were subjects of vehement total order. And if you stepped out of line of that order, well, you could, in Fukuoka for example, get an extra 2-hour shift down the mine. Or, in other places, if you helped a sick mate, well, you'd get your skull split in with a hammer. 2 out of 25 men a month before the peace were fit to work in the mine. 2 out of 25. But also, like I said, there was no revenge. This was done out of boredom. These reactions were done because these men had nothing better to do and no one was coming to get them. Even by the 7th, 8th of September, they were still just in Fukuoka, left to their own devices. And, of course, the predominant emotion was homesickness. Take the men in Johor, for example, and Singapore, when they were given a pen and paper to write their first letter home since their captivity, there was a deadly silence that came over the entirety of them. And they finally had this moment of self-reflection. That is as much a significant reaction to the end of the war as any of the others. It's summed up in a quote from one of the men who saw the lads go out and rob that bank. "I'm afraid I've not the stomach for the way a minority of the lads are carrying on, especially regarding the civilian population. I just want to get home and forget about it all." That last bit, that's the most important part. I just want to get home and forget about it all. Getting home for a lot of the servicemen and a lot of the prisoners of war was going to be an arduous process. There was a point system, basically, that was determined by the length of your tenure in the Pacific, the length of your service, and the amount of family members you had back home, dependents, if you will. That was that among many other things. And these point scores were studied like form guides by the men. For the prisoners of war, well, to take them home, there needed to be ships, and there weren't enough of them. So a lot of them had to make their own way, get their own camps, or, like we saw in Fukuoka and Johor, were just left to their own devices until a ship was ready to come collect them.
Alex, can you tell me what happened between the Japanese surrender and these people getting home?
Well, for some of them, there were extra jobs that needed to be done. Obviously, we talked about the front lines where Japanese didn't realise that surrender had happened or didn't want to accept it. There was also the Japanese atrocities and the war crimes that needed to be tended to. Some men, before they got home, saw to it that some quick justice was dealt. For example, the men at Kuching, prisoner of war camp, the men who liberated it, wept at the sight of the men in the camp. Their emaciated bodies, very shallow graves. These men were on the brink of death. A lot of them had already died. They set up war crimes trials as fast as was legally and logically possible. They wanted these war crimes trials to happen by the 15th of November, but the legal process delayed them basically until the end of December. Similar happened at the Sandakan camp, or at least in Labuan. Sandakan had held, by 1945, over 2,000 Allied prisoners of war, Australians and some British. The conditions in the camp were miserable, and the Japanese decided that they would march from Sandakan to Ranau. Now, on this march, most of the prisoners of war died or fell away. 6 managed to escape on this march. And when they got to Ranau, the Japanese decided that the best option was to execute the remaining prisoners of war, basically to clear the evidence of war crimes. The only 6 survivors of those 2,000 who began at Sandakan in 1945 were the 6 who escaped on the death march. And when Allied soldiers came to liberate them, of course, they were going to want very quick justice. They set up their own war crimes trials too. Plus, there were men who were on the front lines, and they decided that they were going to stick around. Some men signed up for the Japanese occupation force without even seeing Australia in the meantime. Others decided, yeah, I'm going to stick around in Tokyo for 3 months and then go home for the summer. There were complex reactions. Not everyone was the same. Sure, the predominant emotion was homesickness, but some people had just signed up 6 months beforehand and they wanted their film. Once they were out of the maelstrom, most of these people just wanted to return to normalcy. That included contact with their former enemy, especially with Japanese civilians. One wrote, "Human nature is a funny thing. It's hard to believe that only 2 weeks before this, we would have taken the skin off of any Jap we could get our hands on. But when our bellies were full, we actually gave some food to the Japs who were hanging around the billets." Now, for a lot of these men, it was about proving why they'd won, proving why they were different, for some even why they were superior. And these are all indications of just how complex the end of the Second World War was. This is all more than just one moment in one city or one country even. It's more than one period of time. The end of the Second World War was a plethora of moments. It was so many of them that cover so many different emotions because the sheer weight of the Second World War on these people was dramatic. The men who robbed a bank, for example, they didn't really get away with it. The mayor of the Japanese city, whose bank they robbed, rode his bike down to the camp and demanded some compensation. So the camp commandant paraded his men, got them all lined up, and said that these frivolities must cease. The Japanese mayor then gave a speech, and he said, "Look, we understand. We get it. Your men were treated very, very harshly under Japanese rule. Now it's our turn. We understand." But he still demanded compensation. So a hat went round the men, most of them were Australians, demanding 3,000 yen in compensation. Once the hat was passed around everybody, the men had contributed 6,000 yen, double what the mayor was asking for. Everyone had satisfaction. Except, of course, the mayor had to walk home because one of the men had nicked his bike. For some, there was a moment. For some, there was a date. For others, there was an interminable wait. For some, there was happiness, joy, and grief. For others, there was just sadness, numbness, unfortunate gap where someone used to be. To describe the end of the Second World War as incarnating Dancing Man or a novelty VP Day sweater is to undersell the sheer weight which the Second World War put on these people. They could not just be removed of this weight by being told that the war was now over, or that, oh, it's VP Day, the celebrations are here now. Australians had been changed far too much for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. It really does show a depth that we really haven't really plumbed before, looking at the emotion of Australians in Asia, even in Europe, but also the prisoner experience, not only in Changi, but also in Japan and far wider. And it really does take that high school knowledge of history and really turn everything on its head just to look at those emotions and how it really did change Australia from 1945 onwards. And it's you've delivered a really fascinating insight into that period of time. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mick.
Our next speaker today is Olivia Ormsby, who'll be delivering her findings on the Australian soldier experience during the Malayan Emergency. Thanks, Olivia. Welcome.
For a very large part of our time in Malaya, we did nothing but patrol and patrol. Boy, we sure did some walking. It was only on a few occasions that any of our battalion got into a fight. These are the words of Private Norman Simpson, an Australian soldier who served in the Malayan Emergency as part of the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, or 2RAR, from 1955 to 1957. Simpson was one of approximately 7,000 Australian servicemen who served in the Malayan Emergency, from all services including the Army, Navy and Air Force, from between 1950 and 1960. An estimated 33 Australian nurses also served. The Malayan Emergency was one of a few successful counter-insurgency operations undertaken by the Western powers against communists during the Cold War. Yet the conflict and soldiers' experiences have been overshadowed in Australia's military history. It was an unconventional conflict, an undeclared war on a small scale which lasted 12 years, wedged uncomfortably between Australian action in larger conflicts such as the Second World War, Korea and Vietnam.
Olivia, can you tell us a little bit of a background about how the Malayan Emergency began?
So it all began on the 16th of June 1948, when 3 European estate managers in Sungai Siput, northern Malaya, were murdered in 2 separate incidents by guerrilla fighters of the Malayan National Liberation Army, or MNLA. The MNLA was a military arm of the Malayan Communist Party, also known as the MCP, who sought to gain independence from the British Empire and establish a communist state. The party drew on the support of Chinese Malayans, also known as Minuan, who were dissatisfied with British rule in Malaya. The Minuan provided the communist fighters with food, medical supplies and information. They were ordinary civilians, indistinguishable from the rest of the population, which made it difficult to easily identify them. The British colonial government responded to the murders of the European estate managers by declaring a state of emergency, and Malaya would remain in this state of emergency for the next 12 years. The Malayan Emergency was an undeclared war, and this was largely due to insurance purposes. The British used the term emergency rather than war to describe the conflict because London-based insurances would not pay out in cases of civil war. Moreover, the terms terrorists and communist terrorists were used to refer to the enemy because most insurance policies would cover losses caused by terrorism. Almost 90% of the MNLA guerrillas were ethnic Chinese. Their camps were hidden deep in the jungle and included political sections, commissars, instructors and secret service. Their aim was to establish control of the liberated areas from which the government forces had been driven, but they never had much success. Australia was actively involved in the emergency from 1950. On the 27th of June 1950, the Australian Cabinet sent 6 Lincoln bombers to Malaya, along with a small team of army officers experienced in jungle warfare, to advise British authorities on jungle warfare and counter-terrorism techniques, as well as to gather information for the Australian Army. This was known as the Bridgeford Mission. By 1952, the outcome of the emergency had been decided. The communists would be defeated. The British and anti-communist Malay powers had a force of 40,000 British and Commonwealth troops, and almost 67,000 police, and more than 250,000 Home Guard. Supporting the communists were about 7,000 communist guerrillas, and an estimated 1 million Minuan. The emergency finally ended on the 31st of July, 1960.
Olivia, can you tell us a little bit about why Australia was interested in supporting Britain during the Malayan Emergency?
Sure. So Australia's interests in Malaya at the time were largely economic and strategic. Malaya was under British colonial rule and was providing Britain and Australia with cheap tin and rubber, which were vital to the nation's economies. Crucially, there was widespread concern that if communism spread further into Southeast Asia through the loss of Malaya to communist forces, eventually the whole of Southeast Asia would fall victim to the communist advance and thus come under Soviet Union domination. So in April 1955, the Commonwealth established the Far East Strategic Reserve, or FESA, a joint military force of British, Australian and New Zealand armed forces in an effort to deter communist aggression in Southeast Asia. Australian ground forces arrived in Malaya in October 1955. They were Australia's contribution to FESA. This marked the first time in history that Australian troops were to become part of an overseas operational reserve in peacetime. However, by this point the communist threat had subsided and only small pockets of CTs remained in the Malayan jungle. Essentially, Australians were there to help with the mopping up. Each Australian battalion spent 2 years in Malaya. You have 2 RAR were there from 1955 to 1957, 3 RAR from 1957 to 1959, and 1 RAR from 1959 to 1961. In total, 39 Australian servicemen were killed in Malaya, although only 15 of these deaths occurred as a result of operations, and 27 were wounded, most of whom were in the army.
Olivia, can you tell us what kind of Australians were serving in the army at this point in our history, and what sort of recruitment process did they have to go through to serve in the army at this stage?
So the recruits were an eclectic lot in age, character and experience. They were all volunteers, and unlike the citizen soldiers of the Second World War, were professional soldiers. There were young men who had never been on active service and others who had seen action in World War II and Korea. Private Simpson writes of meeting a former British parachutist who had been at Arnhem, someone who had been at Normandy, Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, those who had served in World War II and Korea. You name a war theatre, there was someone who had been there. All here to do the same job, to serve as best we could for a period of 2 years in Malaya. So a basic recruitment requirement was to be at a level of Draft Priority 1, or DP1. Soldiers were required to reach certain levels in military training, individual skills and collective tactical work, physical fitness tests and medical and dental tests. Moreover, they were required to be vaccinated against tropical diseases such as cholera, plague, yellow fever, tetanus and malaria.
So what did their training consist of, and how well did this training prepare them for operations in Malaya?
So the training that each Australian battalion received improved with time. If we look at the training that each battalion had, we can see that 2 RAR were comparatively less prepared than their successors in 3 and 1 RAR to conduct counter-insurgency operations in Malaya. 2 RAR underwent training designed for jungle warfare in a conventional war setting, which left them somewhat ill-prepared for the counter-insurgency operations they'd undertake in Malaya. 2 RAR's Lieutenant Colonel James Ochiltree explained, "There was no emphasis on counter-insurgency training because the idea of the Commonwealth Strategic Reserve was we would be engaged in a conventional warfare role, not chasing communist terrorists around the jungles of Malaya." He received little briefing on the situation in Malaya before the battalion departed Australia, and was not shown the standard British training manual, the Conduct of Anti-Terrorist Operations in Malaya, or ATOM, which distilled the lessons that the British Army had learned from years of fighting the MCP. In fact, he didn't even know it existed. The manual was revised every 6 months or so, and provided soldiers with instructions on matters such as how to best shoot and kill the enemy. For instance, it states, "It is quite essential that when a contact is made, all that is humanely possible is done to turn it into a kill. That means first-class discipline and a very high standard of training in minor tactics and jungle shooting." Lieutenant Brian McFarlane recalled that in training there were no civilians that I can remember ever being portrayed, so it was all just fighting an enemy, whereas in Malaya you had to be careful of the civilians around. 3 RAR were much better prepared for service in Malaya. An advance party from the battalion was sent to Kota Tinggi, Johor for jungle warfare training. 3 days later, a reconnaissance party went to northern Malaya to scout the areas where the battalion was set to operate. Members of the battalion's command were also better prepared. Major Maxwell Byron Simpkin, second in command of 3 RAR, had spent several months with 2 RAR to learn their procedures firsthand. On the ship over to Malaya, the soldiers also received lectures detailing operational realities that they would encounter in Malaya. Copies of ATOM were issued to officers and senior non-commissioned officers in advance, so that they and their troops could familiarise themselves with counter-insurgency procedures. Moreover, pamphlets on Malayan language and culture were also distributed. 3 RAR learned from the mistakes of their predecessors and ensured that they recorded their learnings in the commander's unit diaries to pass on to 1 RAR.
Can you speak a little bit about how the Australians actually found operating as part of the counter-insurgency for the first time?
So, upon arriving in Malaya, Australian battalions were allocated an area of operations to patrol with an allotted target of 1 or more organised groups of CTs. So, operations involved very little combat and a lot of patrolling through the dense jungle, rubber plantations and arid tin fields. The jungle terrain in particular made it quite difficult for soldiers to move quickly, and they were constantly on the watch for CTs. And due to the restricted visibility in the jungle, the most dependable way to main direction was through the use of a compass. Everyone was required to confidently and accurately use one. But Australian soldiers often relied on the knowledge of Iban trackers from Borneo to help them navigate through the dense jungle. And war dogs were also used to help them track CTs. Major Len Johnson of 2 RAR illustrates the toll of patrolling perfectly. He says, our pattern of operating never changed. We patrolled and ambushed all day, every day, in direct sun and monsoon rain. Always alert, unable to rest, and under stress from the constant expectation of sudden and violent action. Even the most basic of daily necessities, such as eating and sleeping and maintaining personal hygiene, were all disrupted by the harsh operational routine, which left soldiers dirty, exhausted, and demoralised. Johnson recalls, we snatched meals, caught up on our sleep where we stood, and rarely had time for a brew or smoke. Our jungle green clothing stuck to our skin like wet cardboard, our boots rotted off our feet, and we all had that sharp, unpleasant smell of men who had not washed or changed for a week. We were forever pushing ourselves, at times so exhausted that it was a struggle to keep going. After 5 days and nights of patrolling and ambushing, we had done all we could and had made no contact with the CTs or found any sign of their presence. In fact, Australian soldiers found themselves battling the Malayan climate, jungle and wildlife as much as, if not more than, they did the CTs. As Simpson asserts, we didn't find many CTs, but we certainly found a lot of leeches and wasps. Tropical diseases like malaria and scrub typhus, carried by the jungle's insects, were also a danger to Australian soldiers. Gastrointestinal diseases like infective hepatitis, amoebic dysentery, and leptospirosis also posed a serious threat, as they had the potential to cause a major manpower wastage for Australia's small force.
So looking at all that, so that they have to deal with not only looking at CTs, jungle animals and tropical diseases, how did the Australians actually find the jungle?
Several soldiers do express an affinity for the jungle in their written accounts. For example, Lieutenant Colin Bannister of 3RAR wrote, as we became familiar with the rainforest, we learned to respect it and started to feel that the jungle really could be your friend. Similarly, Norman Simpson of 2RAR, who had also served in New Guinea during the Second World War, writes of how it was lovely to be back in the jungle. I felt at home. Others, such as Administration Officer Victor Lederer, found themselves feeling lonely and isolated. Suddenly, I was overcome with a silly feeling of utter loneliness. What the hell am I doing here? I thought, but immediately took myself in hand again. It wasn't unusual for soldiers to experience what they called emotional difficulties due to being away from home and the trauma of battle. Yet soldiers who experienced such reactions were neither diagnosed nor treated as psychiatric cases. They and their problems were dealt through administrative rather than medical means.
So looking at the emergency and the conduct of operations, it seems like it's more of a platoon commander's war. Is there a bit of a disconnect between the platoon commander and the more junior commanders on the ground to battalion headquarters?
Yes, definitely. Soldiers' accounts of the emergency really do highlight that disconnect between the battalion headquarters and the troops on the ground patrolling. McFarlane asserts that it was a platoon commander's war, we always used to say, directed by the company. The battalion very rarely operated at battalion level under its headquarters, if ever. McFarlane also explains that this distance was due to the fact that the battalion headquarters were rather far removed from the actual nitty-gritty of the patrolling, and I don't think they ever understood the difficulties that were encountered by platoons and sections in the jungle. And quite obviously, this lack of understanding did cause some frustration among the soldiers. For example, the rules of engagement called for accurate and fast shooting. CTs were to be shown no mercy. The training prepared soldiers to line up a target and shoot accurately and efficiently, but the conditions under which they were meeting the enemy in Malaya meant that the standard of shooting was poor. As McFarlane also explains, anybody who's going to ground in the jungle is very hard to see, and there is only just a moment of opportunity when the enemy is first seen to get a shot at him. Unless the soldier is extremely efficient, a good shot, ready, mentally adjusted to see an enemy just at that very moment, then he's not going to hit him. Soldiers also had to take great care not to shoot themselves or others, which unfortunately did happen. Australian soldiers ultimately did learn how to hone their operations and adjust their equipment and weaponry. As Johnson asserts, as time passed, we gained more experience. We changed our weapons and equipment to suit the conditions of our patrolling and ambushing.
After the Australian soldiers had spent a lot of time on operations, there was obviously that little bit of time for leave afterwards as well. So did they get up to anything that is remarkable whilst they were away from the jungle?
Yeah, so soldiers were allowed a week of leave for every 3 weeks of operations they undertook. And most soldiers used this time to relax and have some fun. However, there were few administrative recreational activities for the soldiers. There were a few film screenings, and sporting matches like cricket and rugby were quite common and were designed to foster positive relationships between the Commonwealth soldiers. Others toured the towns and cities of Malaya, taking in the sights and the history. So soldiers really had to make their own fun, and for a lot of them, this fun involved drinking and fornicating. According to McFarlane, the soldiers were really left with the only means of relaxation they had, booze. And then, when they got on the booze, they got into trouble, so it was a self-perpetuating cycle. Private Simpson describes a funny escapade where he and a mate met an American soldier, quite drunk. He hated the Royal Navy. We told him we were Australians, so he hated the Royal Australian Navy. So it went on and on. We got him absolutely powerlessly drunk, then we carted him off to a tattoo joint, and right across his chest we had a ship put with the crossed American and British flags. Underneath this, in large letters, Rule Britannia. Then we shoved him into a taxi and told the driver to take him to his ship. Many soldiers also relied on more, shall we say, intimate methods to unwind after weeks of patrolling. And an unfortunate result of this method was a high rate of venereal disease. Senior Australian officers, who were mostly ignorant of the operational and social conditions in Malaya, saw fault with Australian officers becoming infected and in officers for not preventing it. Suggestions were made for a controlled brothel in Sungai Siput with girls under strict medical supervision. But when the battalion's chaplains heard about this, all three objected, saying the sin of fornication was more destructive than venereal infections. Their opinion was supported by the visiting prelates, who threatened to expose the scheme if it went ahead, so nothing happened and the soldiers continued to be infected.
Once they're back out in the jungle, they're obviously operating with other forces other than their own nationalities. Can you let me know about how they got along with Dayaks, Iban trackers, and even the local Malayan populace?
So the Australians worked closely with the Iban trackers on operations, and Australians had actually worked with the Dayak tribesmen, including the Iban, in Borneo during World War II. And the first group of 49 trackers were sent to Malaya 8 weeks into the emergency at the request of the Malayan government. Australians also interacted and worked alongside the locals on a domestic level. Some of those who were married and had brought their families to Malaya lived in the married quarters and were allocated a housekeeper or two to help them with the housework. Likewise, the unmarried men also had local people helping them with cleaning their quarters and doing their laundry. So many soldiers enjoyed having a housekeeper assigned to them. It was quite convenient, but for others, the presence of local servants in the home drew feelings of unease as it went against the Australian egalitarian attitude and was deemed an unsettling remain of colonialism.
How did the Australians get along with their Commonwealth allies, and in particular the British?
So as a rule, the Australians got on quite well with most of the Commonwealth soldiers, particularly the New Zealanders. Sergeant Francis Lawrence of 1RAR wrote of his affinity for his fellow Australian and New Zealand soldiers. One must also say several good words on behalf of our crowd, I mean Aussies and Kiwis, because with them one never has a real trouble. The Australians had a far less favourable experience with the British soldiers, who often regarded them as convicts or second-class British citizens. Much of this resentment stemmed from their shared colonial history and differences in national characteristics, international antagonism, and conditions of service. The British were national service conscripts, usually younger and less experienced than the Australians, and the Australians also received better pay and rations. Lawrence described how the British would gang up and fight them. But there are a few rumbles here, always involving Pommies, whose favourite way of dealing with anyone is to attack in a wolf pack fashion, using broken bottles and kicking men's treasure chest. He ends the letter with a statement that leaves no doubt as to what his feelings were toward the British. Down with the Poms, up the Aussie flag, and let the double rum into our throats. And others simply just enjoyed the diversity of the community around them and tried to make friends with anyone. As Bannister put, it was quite comforting to feel part of a community with friends of all races, however transitory our stay was. So, although the Malayan Emergency was an unconventional conflict, small in scale and largely overlooked in the pantheon of Australian military history, it is worth remembering. Australian soldiers' experiences in the emergency provide us with valuable insights into the realities of counter-insurgency warfare on the ground. And on a more personal note, they reflect how the troops felt about their service and made sense of the foreign landscape in which they found themselves. Their accounts, when read alongside official accounts recorded in unit administrative papers, offer us a more complete picture and in turn understanding of the Malayan Emergency. And while subsequent conflicts that the Australians have been involved in have differed from the experience of the Malayan Emergency, there are similarities and general lessons of the counter-insurgency operations from Malaya, which can be gleaned from the past to inform the present and prepare for the future.
Thanks, Olivia. That's a fascinating overview of the Australian soldier experience in Malaya, and it really is such a tiny part of the memorial's galleries, but it has such a significant impact on the rest of the Cold War, but also modern day operations as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so that concludes this year's Summer Scholarship presentation, and I'd like to thank very much Alex Barilaro and Olivia Ormsby for their wonderful presentations, and I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did being here as part of it today.